Okay, so recording started. That's good. You see the opening slide there provides a little backdrop for some of the things we'll be talking about today. I've shown you this slide before, but just another reminder of how a lot of congressmen ignore the Constitution. But we're going to be looking at seeing what the Constitution has to say about providing or promoting the general welfare. So it's a hot topic today. Anyway, everybody grab your books. We'll be using them today. Got my couple readers, couple guys, at least one that likes to stay quiet. Going to force them to read this morning. All right, let's take a look at the homework. And by the way, Ella informed me that the study place says you have homework due Christmas Eve. Well, just to comfort you, you do not have homework due Christmas Eve. So if it says Christmas Eve, just realize that's the first day. It's actually due the first day back to class. In other words, it would be, and I'll go through and try, hopefully remember to fix that. In fact, I'm writing a note right now to do that. But just realize it's due by next class period. Okay, so read chapter 10 in the book, and of course you'll take the quiz on it. Not by next week, but by well, let me pull up my calendar here, because it'll be by I guess by the 7th, right? So it's due by January 7th. Man, that just sounds like a long time, doesn't it? I mean, I'm not going to see you guys till next year. Yeah. So do the read the Constitution section. You know what to do with that. The open book quiz. Okay, that's number 3. Basically, that's what you do before or by January 7th. And then you see some study questions or discussion questions from page 588 to look over. You don't have to submit those answers, but please do look over those questions and ponder them. Also, I've added into your study place a great video. It's a Fox News video, Neil Cavuto discussing really some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today with a college student. It's really good. So it's only about 10 minutes long. Encourage you to see that. Take a look at that, and I'll talk about that later in the class. Continue memorizing in the Declaration, and over the next few weeks, in fact, by the last week of class, you'll need to view the Session 5 video entitled The American Presidency, number 1. Now, I'm giving this to you way in advance, so just so you can fit it in whenever is most convenient. It's not even due by the next class period. That's why I'm putting it in the long-term homework slide. Okay, and there is your memorization. The italicized part is the new language. Any questions on the homework? Do we need to know the Declaration word for? Yes. Now, obviously, only what I'm giving you. I mean, you're not going to have to memorize the entire Declaration. But yes, with this, there's only one version, and it's the Founders version. There's no new Founders version or new living Founders version. It is the Founders version. So, yeah. And it's actually not even the preamble. It's not the first paragraph. It actually begins with the second paragraph. All men are created equal. Paragraph. So, all right. Any other questions on that or anything else? All right. Well, we have been, as we run through this class, going through the preamble of the Constitution line by line. In fact, let me read it for you here. And if you want to see it in front of you, you can open up to page 219 because we're going to be looking at the Constitution today. But 219 in your book is where the preamble is. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense. Okay, we've been looking at all these provisions and kind of like hot links, using them to take us deeper into the Constitution to understand each one of these phrases. Well, we've gone all the way up through providing for the common defense. Today we're going to look at the general welfare clause. You see that last phrase there, promote the general welfare, and see what exactly that means. You know, people often see the general welfare clause as allowing the federal government to do anything it wants. But we're going to see that the Constitution actually limits what the general welfare is. Now, let me bring up the next slide. A little bit about this slide. Santa Claus versus the Grinch, right? What's the point of that besides being two Christmas themes? Very appropriate here right before Christmas break. But what's the point of that? Well, sometimes politicians will portray people who believe in a government of limited powers as the Grinch. You know, they'll say things like, my opponent doesn't care about people, but I do. Or the other party doesn't care, but we do. Those other folks, they're like the Grinch, but, you know, I'm like Santa Claus, unlimited money to dole out to anybody who asks. Now, they won't actually use the Santa or Grinch analogy, but that's basically the way they want to paint their opponents and versus painting themselves as being, you know, very generous, wanting to help people. But as you started seeing in the chapter you were reading, there's really a hypocrisy in all of this, because these folks try to appear like they're being generous, but we'll see in a moment why they're really not. And so this raises the question, well, whose job is it to provide for charity anyway, and to provide for the general welfare anyway? Well, earlier in the semester, we spent a lot of time, right, talking about worldviews. Remember what a worldview is? Because all this, honestly, impacts on how we answer this question. Um, oh, and Christine, I just saw your question. Will we need to watch any other videos on the DVD? No. I think that will be the last one. Because you already saw number 6, right? So number 5... yeah, is the last one. So yeah, if you get it done before you leave, that's right. And so this is your last week here, right? And then you're off to Scotland. But then we'll see you on the other end of Christmas break, right? You'll still be tuning in. So we're not saying goodbye to you this week, right? Okay, very good. Anyway, what is a worldview? How would you guys explain that to somebody? I mean, you know, worldview really starts describing your foundational beliefs, right? Yeah, how you view the world. Very good, Hannah. Your foundational beliefs. Some have put it. It's the the type of glasses you wear, or the lens that you see the world through. You know, that's a good analogy. But basically, yeah, it is your underlying beliefs that affects how you view the world. It affects how you view current issues. It affects how you view the government, what it should be doing. It affects your family, your relationships. Um, um, you know, in the biblical view, okay, God is King and Savior. But in the humanistic view, who is actually in the role of King and Savior in the humanistic view? Government, exactly right. Civil government. So one thing we've seen is that the founders had a biblical worldview. They believe that God's word actually limits what a government official can do. And that's at the heart of why we were set up to have a limited government. So who does have the authority for providing for the poor? Well, to answer a question like that, people would probably throw out, several things. You see there on the screen several possible answers for who cares for the poor, including Santa Claus, I suppose. Uh, but what would you guys say? And can you think of any scriptures to make your point? Who does have the responsibility? And I know you're going to be hard pressed for the last choice, but uh, but what would you say to that? What scriptures would you use to make your case for who should provide for the poor? Should anybody provide for the poor? Is it just their tough luck? Ben says everyone. Okay, well, what does everyone mean? So does that mean all the answers there on the screen? You would just say all the above. Ben qualifies. Okay, all individuals. Okay. Do you all agree with Ben? Do you have, regardless of position? So, how would you uh, make the case biblically for that? Can you think of any examples? By the way, the next few slides that we go through, um, you don't have on in your notes. So, but you can use those slides to help take notes on the slide that you have in front of you. I mean, not on your computer screen, but in your notes. Deuteronomy 15, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, to the poor in your land. Good. Okay, that's a good one. Hannah, whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed. Proverbs 19:17. Excellent. All right. So, yeah, there's some verses making the case that we are uh, under obligation. We're expected um, to be generous and to tithe. We'll talk about that when we get to church. But let's look at just some. This is really the tip of the iceberg. Yeah, Jesus told people to provide for the poor. Here's a great example of that: the Good Samaritan, right? I mean, the whole point of that was a guy uh, who was kind of a natural enemy, and yet he was still showing love and taking care of somebody in need, right? And then Proverbs. I mean, there's a lot of Proverbs. Hannah gave us Proverbs 19:17. You see the one on the screen, Proverbs 28:27. He who gives to the poor will lack nothing, but he who closes his eyes to them receives many curses. So obviously, you get God's position on this just in that one verse, right? In the book, you read about American-based charity, especially in our early country's history. Do you remember? In fact, this impressed Alexis de Tocqueville when he came from France to the United States. What was the difference that he pointed out between the two countries? How charity was handled in America versus how it was handled in France. Oh, and I just realized I never gave you the URL. There's going to be one video that we take a look at a little bit later. I put it right there, so if you want to just get it started and then pause it. Okay, so charity comes directly from the people instead of the government. Although Hannah, you didn't say where that was. Christina says in America, associations or organizations took care of the poor, whereas in France it was the government. Taylor, but I figured I knew what you meant, Hannah. U.S. is handled by individuals instead of the government. Ben says the French government handled the poor, but the American people gave to the poor. Exactly right. And so you read about examples, just some examples of charity from our early history, and even today, Americans are very generous. Consider after 9/11, when the planes flew into the buildings, etc. People gave almost $3 billion to private charities after 9/11, to help take care of people who had their world really turned upside down by the terrorist attacks. And if you look at Hurricane Katrina in 2005, in just the first 3 months, nearly $2.7 billion were donated. That's according to the Red Cross. So, it's really astounding. Our private giving to charity in the United States is greater than the economies of some countries in the world. So, when you hear individuals have a responsibility to care for the poor, many Americans take that responsibility seriously. It's not to say that we couldn't do better. Probably most Americans don't even tithe, so or give 10%. So yeah, we could do better. But having said that, Americans still are very generous. So certainly individuals have a responsibility. You also see this in terms of families. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So providing within families is important. And of course, when you're growing up, you see that basically one directionally. Your parents are taking care of you now. But realize the tables will be turned. And remember, Jesus talked about this. Remember what he said. We looked at Matthew 15 and Mark 7 earlier in the semester. Remember what he rebuked the Pharisees for, what they weren't doing? I mean, I know Jesus rebukes the Pharisees for a lot of things, but in those two passages, what were the Pharisees doing wrong this time? They'd rebuke Jesus because his disciples weren't following a tradition, and he zings back and says, well, you guys, you follow your traditions and you ignore God's law. And what was the law that they were ignoring in God's word? What weren't they doing? They weren't taking care of their parents. Yeah. He said, honor your father and your mother, but you guys don't do that. In fact, you have this tradition where you will give money to the church, call it korban, and then that relieves you of any responsibility to use what money that should have been used for something else. Now you can just wash your hands type thing. He didn't say wash your hands. That actually comes from Pilate, right? But you get the idea. This alleviates you of any responsibility. By the way, did you notice that Jesus also provided for his mom? And I may have mentioned this earlier, but when he was on the cross, he gives charge over his mom. And scholars assume that by this point, his dad Joseph was already dead. So he gives charge over his mom to the apostle John. That's you can read that in John 19, John chapter 19, verses 26 and 27. But anyway, so you see, this is a really important thing to God, and so I certainly encourage you guys, when your parents get older, look, Social Security may not be there for them, probably certainly ain't going to be there for you guys. But anyway, you're going to have a responsibility to care for them, even if they're drawing minimal Social Security checks. The chief duty for caring for them will fall to you guys. All right, so just start getting mentally prepared for that. You have the responsibility to take care of the needy inside of your family, and as you guys get older, that will involve taking care of your parents. So there's individuals, families. There's also the church, which of course is made up of individuals. And you see this passage in Deuteronomy 14 about bringing all the tithes in to provide for the Levites, aka priests, pastors, priests, right? But also aliens, fatherless, widows. Okay, so there's a church responsibility, and us as members of the church. That's part of what our tithe is being used for. And let me go on to the next category, because I think this one, the church is relatively obvious to you guys. But before we discuss this next category, we're going to have our weekly quiz, okay? And like most quizzes, don't answer right away. I'm going to give you the question, and then we'll all answer together. But the question is, what is the Bible story that is being depicted here? And I'm going to give you 4 choices, and again, hold off on answering right away. But what is the Bible story that's being depicted here? Is it A, the first example of golf in the Bible? And, let me explain that. I mean, is that Jacob's family, where they're looking for the ball that's gone off the fairway, and so they're searching for the ball in the bushes? I mean, that there's actually a lot of sports mentioned in the Bible. I mean, if you're thinking, oh, that's ridiculous, look, tennis is mentioned in the Bible. Joseph served in Pharaoh's court. I mean, come on, right? And, baseball's mentioned. I mean, that one's obvious, right? In the beginning, Yeah, I mean, yeah, had a long baseball game. But even interestingly, later on in Genesis, Rachel took the pitcher to the well. So there's a lot of sports involved, and Joseph served in Pharaoh's courts, tennis. So anyway, is this the first example of golf in the Bible? Is it the woman caught in adultery? Is it a story from Ruth's life, or is it hard labor in Egypt under Pharaoh? Sorry, James. All right, I'm going to count to three, and you guys can make your selection. So here we go. Uno, dos, tres. Hit enter. Oh, come on. I couldn't sell any of you on golf. All right, the correct answer is actually C. Yes. What is Ruth doing here? You all got it right. What is she doing? I mean, it kind of looks like the woman caught in adultery scene, but it's not. She is gleaning the leftover grain in Boaz's field. And that's a pretty good description of what gleaning is. It's where the workers go through and they pick the food off the stalks or whatever, but then they're not supposed to pick it to the bones, so to speak. They're not supposed to get every last bit. They're supposed to save some for the poor to be able to work the fields and go through and collect food. And that was called gleaning. Now, there's several principles that we can actually glean from this, pardon the pun, but a lot of things that harvest the truth wherever you can. But there's a lot of things we can learn from this principle of gleaning. And so I'll list just a couple things, two or three things that I think can be taken from this. You can write this down. But number one, it's obvious that God cares for the poor. I mean, you see this in God's law. Um, the fact that people are actually commanded morally to not pick all the grain, but to leave some there for the poor to be able to pick. So that right there shows God's heart in wanting to care for the poor. So that's number one. God cares for the poor. Number two, God gives the responsibility to care for the poor to individuals. You notice this isn't a government program. This is individuals, the owners of the farms who are providing for the poor. So the responsibility to care for the poor is an individual responsibility, but you notice even then it's not God commanding just like a welfare program in the sense of just giving things freely to people. It's you see this principle of work for food. I mean, these people had to work for it. They just didn't line up, for a soup kitchen type of thing. And by the way, I'm not denigrating soup kitchens or saying those are wrong. I'm just saying, just realize in just looking at gleaning here and taking what principles we can from this, that the whole idea of working for food is going to be an important part of helping provide for the poor. But in all of this, you don't see the civil government just giving free handouts. In fact, you never see that anywhere in the scriptures given as a godly model. And check me out on that. Now, having said that, some people, in fact, I've even been asked this in class once in all the years I've taught, but there are some I would call liberal theologians who have appealed to Genesis 47 as an example of civil government being involved legitimately, supposedly, legitimately in welfare. In Genesis 47, of course, I forgot, sorry, I forgot to bring up this slide. So before I go to the next one, you see the gleaning laws there in Leviticus 23 and Deuteronomy 24. You see the work for food principle in 2 Thessalonians 3:10. If a man will not work, he shall not eat. But having said that, then Genesis 47 is the passage dealing with Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dream and basically saving the whole known world from starvation. Now, here's the situation. I mean, what about this? As a government official, the second in command over Egypt, didn't Joseph preside over one of the greatest government welfare programs in antiquity, and wasn't God behind it? I mean, God gave Pharaoh a dream about the upcoming famine. Joseph interpreted it, right? And then Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge over the whole country. And it was his plan for the government to store up food and then parcel it out. I mean, Joseph's a godly man, so that must mean this plan was okay as an example for the rest of human history, right? I mean, isn't this a prime example of government welfare? Well, Hannah and Ben know their Bibles. Absolutely. Now, I'm just giving you the case. I've just given you the case without agreeing with it. What some theologians have actually made that case. And when I say liberal, I mean it in the sense that um, a liberal person theologically, I would define as one who doesn't necessarily take God's word to be, inerrant, to be God's word, that it's, full of errors, mistakes, man's ideas, etc. But nevertheless, they realize the importance of trying to make an appeal to the Bible. So there are people who have made this case. But as Ben and Hannah point out, there's some problems with using this because, first of all, the people paid Joseph for it. This wasn't a store up the grain and then just parcel it out and give it away. The people didn't get it for free. Read Genesis 47, verse 14. The people pay for it, but it gets even worse than that, because not only do they pay for it year after year as the famine continues, the people run out of money, and when they run out of money, do you remember what happens? The people sell themselves and their land to the Pharaoh, and they become slaves of Pharaoh. And you see that in the chapter as well, verses 19 to 24. And by the way, as slaves, the Pharaoh ends up giving them grain to plant in their fields. And as slaves, 20% of what they produce then belongs to Pharaoh. They get to keep 4/5 of it, but 1/5 of it is going to go to the Pharaoh when they're slaves. So that's a 20%, you might say, tax rate. Keep that figure in mind because we're going to come back to this idea. But just to wrap this up, who should care for the poor? Well, we talked about individual responsibility, Luke 10, Proverbs 28. Some of you brought up some other passages. You see other examples in the New Testament, like in Acts 2, people providing for other people's needs. The family has a responsibility, 1 Timothy 5:8. It's not on the screen, but we talked about Matthew 15 and Mark 7. That was the passage where Jesus rebukes the Pharisees for not caring for their parents. There's church examples, Deuteronomy 14, we looked at that passage. We could have talked about how Paul took up collections for, people who were destitute and hurting, or churches that were needy. What about civil government? Does God lay out the case for civil government? Well, the answer is no. But the one example that I've seen, again, theologians try to use is the Genesis 47 example, but as we just saw, that is not an example at all of government welfare taking place. So, there you have the biblical principles. Any questions on that? Any questions on what we've talked about? I mean, looking at all this, I think we can conclude that from a biblical worldview, civil government is not supposed to be acting like Santa. And of course, Santa's probably a bad example because Santa, assumably, uh, provides all of this from his own wealth, right? But that's not even what civil government does. because it's not the government officials giving it to the people, they're taxing it. They're taking it from others, right? So really, welfare becomes a system of redistribution, redistributing wealth. But if the civil government is not supposed to redistribute wealth and not to get involved in charity, then really there's little need for the government to collect lots of money for the people. And so this raises the question, if they're not supposed to be raising that much money from the people to redistribute the wealth, well, then how much should the government be taxing? And how much tax is too much of a tax? Remember the warnings that Samuel gave the people when they wanted a king? Okay, so we looked at this last week. Remember, Samuel laid out the curses for them. Well, part of the curse would be that the king would tax them 10%. That would be their tax. The king you have chosen will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief. Notice this, what God is saying. When you're paying 10%, in other words, when the government is demanding as much as God does, then that's equated with slavery. Okay? Now remember the Egyptians? I said to keep that in mind. How much were they paying? And in fact, the Bible says they sold themselves into slavery, and as slaves, they were paying. How much were they paying? I know that was several slides ago, right? 20%. So double the rate that God says you become a slave. Which raises an interesting question. How much do Americans pay in taxes today as a percentage? Do you know how much Americans pay? On average, all levels of government. That includes federal income tax and all other federal kind of taxes, even the hidden taxes, uh, state and local, and of course, state and local would include real estate taxes. Where I live in Fairfax County, they are particularly heinous. They are really draconian. Um, Christina says over 50, and you're about right on. It's about at 50%. Now that's the average, okay? So it's going to be lower in some places. If you live in New York City, it's actually between 60 and 70%. That's why only rich people live in New York City, because I mean, who can afford 60? And again, that's all levels of government. After you've paid federal, state, local, it includes all the, like the electricity tax and the water tax and things that you buy that have, there's been import taxes. So, people have crunched the numbers. It comes up to, for the average person, around 50%. 50%! God says you become a slave at 10. I'm like, Lord, my prayer is, please smite us with the curse of the 10% tax. Oh my God, we would be much better off. We're like, 5 times worse than what God said was, slavery. I mean, we're even like more than double worse than it was in Egypt. I mean, you think they had it bad? We actually have it worse. It's really remarkable. That right there tells you government is doing too much. The biblical principle is limited government. This tells you government's doing too much. The fact that it thinks it, and my heart just sinks every time I see another story about, we're giving billions or, millions or billions to, other countries. I mean, so a lot of times it's not even staying here, I mean, not that would necessarily, I guess you could argue maybe that's better, but, no, I mean, we're spreading it all over the world. Now, and we're going to get to the Constitution, before we look at what the Constitution says, I want you to see something very interesting in Deuteronomy 17. And why don't we get our first reader, Ben, to read this and help us discuss this. Hey, yes. How are you doing today, Ben?
I'm pretty good. I'm a little hungry, but getting dinner soon.
All right. if you would, I'm going to have you read this slide. And as you read the slide, I want you to be keen on what are the restrictions that God puts on the king so that you can summarize this. And just a heads up for the bigger picture, we're going
All
to
right.
see that in principle, the restrictions that God puts on the king, most of them are found in principle in the Constitution. Okay, so that's where we're going with this. But go ahead, why don't you read this and then just summarize for us what are the restrictions on the king? Go ahead.
When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and you have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us, like all the other nations around us, be sure to you the king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your own brothers. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not a brother Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has said, not to go that way. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold.
All right. So what are the restrictions that you see there?
So the king has to be a Israelite. He cannot get lots of horses, and he can't send people to Egypt to get those horses. And then he can't have lots of wives or lots of silver and gold.
Okay. Very good. Thank you, Ben, for that. Now, let's take these one by one. The first one Ben mentioned was he had to be an Israelite. In other words, he couldn't be a foreigner. Isn't it interesting? The U.S. Constitution says the president must be a natural born citizen. That's in Article 2, Section 1. A few years back, when the Terminator was governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, he was a Republican, and a lot of people in the Republican Party were hoping to draft him to run for president, but they realized one thing that would need to be done was the Constitution would have to be amended to allow for it, because he's a natural born to Austria, so he can't run for president. So anyway, that's one of the principles that has been, or prohibitions that was carried over in principle into our Constitution. Here's the second one that Ben mentioned. The king could not multiply horses. Now, what's the point of that? I mean, is God just against horse farming? Would he rather have the kings raise rabbits instead? I mean, what's the point? Aha! Gold star for Christina. Limited army. Yes. This prohibition is all about limiting the military strength. I mean, horses were the tanks of their day. By the way, how did you see this kind of limitation in principle recently in class? Remember we talked about this? How do we see this type of limitation in our Constitution? What was the point that we had been really going over the past couple weeks? And here again, this is an important principle that we see in more than one place in the Bible. We see it listed in 1 Samuel 8. It's going to be a curse when you get the I almost said president you want, the king you want, because he's going to draft your sons and create an army. So yeah, in the Constitution, they tried to avoid large standing armies. So there was the limitation, as Ben says, the 2-year period for funding the army, and then, as William points out, using the militia, that is, using the American populace instead of a standing army. So, right, very good. That principle was absolutely no federal police and no permanent army, just temporary but not permanent. So that was the second limitation, and again, here you see it, and again, this principle has been woven through our Constitution. I mean, it's really amazing. I mean, you see that the Founding Fathers were really well schooled, and we actually get into this in the second semester. But number 3, The king could not multiply silver or gold. King could not multiply silver or gold. Well, how do we see that in principle in our Constitution? Well, originally there was no direct tax, such as an income tax, that was allowed. You see that Article 1, Section 9. Wouldn't that have been nice to live in a day before the income tax? Also, there was no power to print money, only to coin money. Article 1, Section 8. That, by the way, why is that a limitation? Why this limitation on printing money? What's the whole point there? What were they after? Or what were they trying to prevent? Yeah, they're trying to prevent what happened in Germany with the hyperinflation. Now, Germany hadn't happened yet, but they had had their own hyperinflation during the colonies. So they're very familiar with what could be done with paper money. So this, again, was a limitation on the power of government to do things by preventing them from printing more and more money, which actually becomes a form of stealing because it does inflate the currency and reduces people's purchasing power. That's maybe a lot of big words there, but since this isn't economics class, I'm not going to take the time to explain all that. But if you get what I'm saying, inflation basically makes things cost more. That's the simple way of putting it. And then finally, while the state governments would otherwise be allowed to use paper money if the Constitution didn't prohibit it, the Constitution actually did prohibit it. State governments can't print or use paper money. Article 1, Section 10. So all these restrictions on multiplying silver and gold, so to speak, you see that limitation on the king. In principle, we have several ways that we see this restriction on our federal government, and it was all about limiting their power. Because see, the founders would have said the government doesn't need lots of money because it's not supposed to do much. It's not supposed to multiply silver or gold, right? We're supposed to have a very limited government. Remember, that's what Romans 13 was all about. Remember the whole authority versus power? If God gives authority to somebody, then they don't have unlimited power, right? Civil government's authority is to punish evildoers. That's what they're supposed to do. Civil officials can't just do anything they want. God is the only being in the universe that's unlimited. Sadly, a lot of times our government officials think that their power is unlimited. It's not, you know. But today, people have become accustomed to looking to civil government to be like a Santa Claus or like a Robin Hood, But God did not establish the government to be like a Robin Hood, this stealing from the rich to give to the poor. That's actually kind of the popular way of describing Robin Hood. Actually, if you read, there really was a Robin of, I think it's of Moxley. There really was a Robin Hood historically. And although he wasn't actually stealing per se from the rich, historically he was taking money, as if you were to talk to him, money that was stolen from the people by the government, by the ruling class. And so he was, stealing that to give back to the people, basically what was rightfully theirs. So it's kind of been distorted over the years. But we have a commandment that deals with this, stealing, right? The eighth commandment says, don't steal. I mean, does that just apply to individuals, or does it apply to civil government or government officials as well? Well, I mean, obviously that commandment applies to everybody, right? When Zacchaeus got saved, he was personally convicted of his sin and of his stealing. And he said, as a government official, as a tax collector, he would pay back his victims at 4 times the rate he had stolen from them. That's biblical restitution. That's biblical restitution. And look at the slide, the verse there on the screen. The Bible makes it clear that even stealing for the purpose of charity is wrong. Proverbs 6 says, "Men do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy his hunger when he is starving. Yet if he is caught, he must pay sevenfold, though it costs him all the wealth of his house." So, in other words, redistributing the wealth is wrong, even if it's stealing for noble purposes. It's still wrong. Okay? So that's kind of a bird's eye biblical view. Now, having said all this, what if the principle of taking from the rich to give to the poor is actually found in the Constitution? I mean, what if, and I'm saying if, that's what's meant by the phrase promote the general welfare, or as it says later, provide for the general welfare. I mean, one could argue that there's a certain logic to saying that if it's authorized under our Constitution, then it's okay. So now we got to look at, well, what does the Constitution say? Does the general welfare clause authorize the redistribution of wealth? Is this language saying that the government can meet any need? Bail out hurting banks, buy out hurting car manufacturers like it did with GM, or bailing out states that are bankrupt, or maybe on the individual level, government giving food stamps and health care and anything else we need. I mean, is that what is meant by this phrase? Now, I raise that as a question. If you didn't know the answer, where do you think you would go in the Constitution to find the answer? Where do you think you would go? Now, hopefully you have your constitutions open still, because we're going to be taking a look at this. Christina, okay, when you say the General Welfare Clause, what are you referring to? Are you talking about the preamble that we've been looking at? Because the preamble, and actually, hang on just a second. What is, okay, Christina says no, right, because actually the General Welfare Clause comes later, and it's actually found, and then you nailed it, Article 1, Section 8. Remember the John 3:16 of the Constitution? I mean, if you say that to anybody, they probably won't know what you're talking about. That's kind of my description, because it really is the heart of the Constitution. It lays out the powers of what the government's supposed to do. Thanks so much, Michael. So Article 1, Section, if you want to turn to it in your book, page 222, there in Appendix A. And it starts off, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes. Okay, so Congress has power to get people's money. For what purposes? Well, if you read on, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Okay. So based on this language, what are 3 reasons for taxes? Well, to pay the debts, provide for the common defense, provide for the general welfare. Now, that is the General Welfare Clause. Okay, we're looking at it right now. But here again, we have the question, what is the general welfare? Several years ago, I bought this kid's book. I think it was at a homeschool convention, in order to teach the Constitution to my kids, because I teach them the Constitution as part of our history / government, and this was a nice picture book, and I thought I'm teaching my younger kids too, and so I figured this would help illustrate the provisions in the preamble, because it's a very, like, it's mostly illustrations, and I thought, oh, this will be really cool. It'll help them visualize. Well, unfortunately, I didn't look at this book carefully enough in the bookstore, because I brought it home, and as I'm showing it to my kids, I realized, to my shock and horror, that the author's explanation of the general welfare includes anything and everything the federal government does today. I mean, he says general welfare includes spending taxpayers' money for medical insurance, tobacco farmers, food stamps, housing allowance, college students. By the way, speaking of college students, I highly recommend that debate between Neil Cavuto and that college gal who's arguing that the taxpayers should pay for like all college tuition, and like she has a number of demands that she wants, and it is you will enjoy this. I mean, it kind of becomes like a friendly debate, but it's painful to watch. You know, decades ago there was a championship football game before the Super Bowl was called the Super Bowl. It was called the championship game. The Chicago Bears blew out the Redskins in the championship 77 to nothing. I mean, it was a blowout. It was either 70 or 77 to nothing. I forget. I mean, you never see blowouts like that. Anyway, when you watch this video, it is a blowout like that because he just starts asking her, "How are we going to pay for this?" And it really gets embarrassing. She has no idea. Um, she definitely didn't take my class because she really, I mean, basically she wants to, stick it to the top 1% to the rich. But then Neil Cavuto shows her just very calmly and methodically, that even if you confiscated all the money from the top 1%, it would only allow the government to run for so long, and then what are you going to do? I mean, it's really good. Um, so anyway, just some entertainment watching over the Christmas breaks. But all these examples, as I'm going through this book, he's saying are the general welfare. But are they? I mean, if that is that what it means to provide for the general welfare? If so, then why stop at the things that the author just mentioned, or that I was mentioning that he mentioned? I mean, why not include things like, why not a sauna for every family? I mean, that would be good. Or wouldn't you guys like something like an Enzo Ferrari in your driveway? I mean, why not have the general welfare provide that for everybody? Why not increase the minimum wage to, in Seattle they've done $15 an hour, but why stop there? Why not 20? Why not $50 an hour? You know? Heck, why not just guarantee everybody $100,000 a year salary? I mean, what would be the effect on the economy? Those of you who've taken Mr. Rucker's class, right, his economics class, what would be the effect on the economy if our government guaranteed all these things that I'm laying out? Oh my goodness, Ella, I haven't seen that. I need to make a note. Stephen, I mean, you guys, I think, did see. It wasn't Crowder. It was Tim Hawkins talking about the government can. If you haven't seen that one, go watch that on YouTube. It's very funny. But I'll have to check this Stephen Crowder one on Bernie. His motto is "Feel the burn." Oh yeah, we'll feel the burn, all right. But what would be the effect on the economy if government was to forcibly provide all these things for us? Wouldn't this be great? I mean, I'd love an Enzo Ferrari. I mean, not very practical, but I would drive it on the weekends with everybody else on the road driving their Enzo Ferraris. I mean, I don't know how much they cost. They're like hundreds of thousands of dollars, I think, right? I mean, or is it just in the tens of thousands? I don't know. Maybe one of you knows. Yeah, it is short-sighted, but why? I mean, are there any pragmatic problems with this? If government was to demand a certain wage, that people get paid a certain wage, or if it was to provide all these incredible benefits like saunas and cars and houses. Aha, Christina says, for one, businesses would go bankrupt. Yeah, there would be massive unemployment. In fact, Seattle's already dealing with this now. Now that they raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour, there are some businesses that have had to relocate. A lot, they're finding that business owners aren't excited about hiring new people, knowing that because they can't afford the $15 an hour. I mean, it's great if you have a job and your employer can afford to pay that to you, or I say afford, they can manage to pay it to you. But if you don't have a job, good luck finding a job. Because when you raise the minimum wage like that, businesses, they got to look at the bottom line. So yeah, massive unemployment. And if the government printed the money to guarantee everybody's welfare, or all these ideas that I was throwing out, then we really would see hyperinflation like in Germany in the early 1900s, or in our early country's existence during the colonies. You know, now here's the thing: some of the people who were opponents of the Constitution in the late 1780s thought that this general welfare language that we're talking about could become a problem. And so here's what they said. This general welfare clause allows Congress to do anything it wants in the name of helping society or individuals. Well, to this, in Federalist Paper 41, James Madison, who we know as the father of the Constitution, answered this objection, and he said, no way, absolutely no way can you interpret the General Welfare Clause to be interpreted, by the way it's being interpreted today, which is that okay, no problem, Hannah. So, yeah, you just can't interpret it that way. Merry Christmas to you too, Hannah. Hannah's having some internet difficulties. So let me get William to read the next three slides for us. There it is, and William. Hey, William, how are you?
I'm good.
All right. I will advance the slides as you read, and then, again, with Madison, he's going to say things in a convoluted way, at least for modern ears. So we're going to try to figure out as we go along here what he is saying. So why don't you read it for us and see if you can give us a modern day translation of this. Again, he's answering the objection that, the General Welfare Clause, where it says provide for the general welfare there in Article 1, Section 8, that's going to allow the federal government to, basically do anything it wants in the name of providing for the people, providing for, people's welfare. Okay, so what does Madison say to that, William?
Had no other enumeration or definition of the powers of the Congress been found in the Constitution than the general expressions just cited, the authors of the objection might have had some color for it.
Anyway, first of all, please know this is a great day. We got William to say more than a couple of words, so this is really exciting, groundbreaking even. Anyway, just tweaking you a little more there, William. What is Madison talking about there?
I think he's saying that if there weren't any checks for the Congress, then um, then the Congress, it would be okay to say that they can do whatever they want. But the Constitution lays down several checks and stuff, so they can't do that.
Okay, you're very close. I wouldn't use the word checks. Notice he says had no other enumeration or definition of the powers. In other words, remember, the Constitution specifically says what the federal government can do. Okay? So that's what he means by enumeration or definition of the powers, that they're specifically stated. So he's saying if that hadn't been done, then exactly what you said, William, it's like these guys who are objecting, they would have some credibility to their argument. That's what he means by might have had some color for it. They would have had some credence to their objection. But, and here he goes on to the but, that's actually not the case. So take it away, William, and then I'll advance it to read the last, so you can read the last slide as well.
But what color can the objection have when a specification of the objects alluded to by these general terms immediately follows, and is not even separated by a longer pause than a semicolon? Nothing is more natural nor common than first to use a general phrase, and then to explain and qualify it by a recital of particulars.
Okay, again, he gets really wordy there, but are you catching what he's saying, William, or you want me to summarize it? Okay, what's he saying?
He's saying that first they say you can provide for the general welfare, and then they specifically lay out in the clauses after that exactly how they can provide for it.
Bingo. That's exactly right. Nice job, William. And not only that, I mean, I'll go back a slide. He says, where we lay out the powers, it's not even separated by a longer pause than a semicolon. It's true. I mean, when you read the founding fathers, sometimes their sentences go on forever, and this is an example here. Article 1, Section 8 is like one big long sentence, and that's his point. It's not even separated by a longer pause than a semicolon. And I like how he says this. It's a common thing to use a general phrase and then you explain it. Think about when you're writing in school, like a term paper or an essay for a teacher, and doesn't she always have you or he have you do like a thesis statement? And obviously, your thesis statement doesn't say everything that you're going to say in your paper. It's a general statement, that lays out here's where I'm going to be going, and then all the following paragraphs start fleshing it out, right? So, you understand what he's saying here. You have a general phrase first, and then you explain it. And it's like he's saying, guys, it's even in the same sentence. It was just a measly semicolon, right? So, having said all of this, as you look at Article 1, Section 8, and all these powers are laying out what the general welfare is, what is the general welfare? Look at Article 1, Section 8. Now, keep in mind, some of those things are going to relate to providing for the common defense, okay? Like raising armies and navy, etc. But which ones would explain what they meant by providing for the general welfare? There in Article 1, Section 8. Go ahead, type into your chat box. My mic is on, is it not? I'm not just speaking to myself. Okay, good. The question was, in Article 1, Section 8, what are the provisions that would lay out what the general welfare is? Remember, he says that after the general phrase, provide for the general welfare, we lay out the particulars, the specifics of what providing for the general welfare means. So what are those things in Article 1, Section 8? Now, some of them are going to be relate to providing for the common defense, but what are the ones to to provide for the general welfare? Okay, so borrowing money would be for the sake of providing for the general welfare. In other words, not borrowing money for the sake of borrowing money, but borrowing money for the sake of doing things like what Christina said. Well, actually, no, that's other ways of getting the money. So, Ben and Christina, you've given ways of getting the way the federal government gets the money, but it's getting the money to do what? Okay, Ben says to regulate commerce. That would be one example. Okay, so the Commerce Clause is one example of providing for the general welfare. What are some of the other things besides regulating commerce in Article 1, Section 8? Go on, I'm relying on you guys for this. You've got your books open, Article 1, Section 8. Establish rules of naturalization and bankruptcies. Good. Okay, so provide and maintain a navy. Okay, now that one, well, yeah, it would help the general welfare, obviously. I would put that under the category of providing for the common defense. Okay, so providing and maintaining a navy would be common defense. I mean, even though you could make an argument for the general welfare. To coin money, okay, coining money is something that they're saying that's providing for the general welfare. Fixing the standard weights and measures. Establishing post offices and roads. Good. Or I guess technically it says postal roads, which maybe leaves open the question, was the post office supposed to be federal? But it's certainly been interpreted that way. But Certainly establishing postal roads is what it says, punishing counterfeiting. Okay. Okay, good. We're starting to get more and more examples. You also have protecting authors and inventors. That's in Clause 8. Calling forth the militia to enforce the law. That's Clause 15. Good. All right. Ben, you got most of them. Nicely done. Gold star for the day. But anyway, so realize what's happened here. The term general welfare is only supposed to apply to the things that pretty much Ben and some of the rest of you were laying out in Article 1, Section 8. That is what providing for the general welfare is. And really, that's not very much. You see, there were very few things that the federal government was to do. I mean, there's nothing in there about health care, right? I mean, you can't just look at the phrase general welfare and say, oh, that means provide health care for everybody. No, Madison would say no. Look at the powers that come right after that. If health care is mentioned there, okay, then yeah, it means health care. But if it's not there, then no, that's not what that means. There's very few things the federal government was supposed to do. And, both supporters and opponents of the Constitution back in the 1780s, if they agreed on one thing, it's that the federal government should not be involved in charity. The hatred of public, taxpayer-funded charity was deeply rooted in this nation and really remains so until about the early to mid-1900s. There's that very interesting story from the early part of the 19th century where we see that Representative Davy Crockett, Davy Crockett, learned the important lesson in this regard, right? I mean, remember that? Crockett learned that, true welfare, let me bring up the next slide, true welfare is not giving away other people's money, but rather using one's own money to bless others. Still, Congress tried to use money to do things that were not specified in the Constitution. So presidents like Monroe vetoed bills for roads, bridges, and tunnels. Oh my! Things that Monroe and some other presidents said, look, these things aren't mentioned in the Constitution. We'll actually look at this more in the Government 2 class. But see, what politicians want to do is to tax people and then spend the money in a way that makes them look super generous. This becomes very tempting for them. And, sadly, shortly after the Constitution was crafted, politicians had already started doing that. We certainly see this problem today. Why does Thomas Sowell suggest that most politicians who are considered generous are not really being compassionate at all? And he answered quite simply, they aren't generous with their own money. Vice President Gore gave tiny charitable contributions from his own income. In 1997, when he was vice president, he gave $353 in 1 year. $353. But on the other hand, he supported throwing billions and trillions of dollars of the taxpayers' money for all sorts of, problems. Fix things and provide for this or that. Now contrast this, by the way, to the Bush-Cheney team, the presidents in the early president-vice president team in the early 2000s. President Bush, unlike Vice President Gore, gave more than 10% to charity. I assume he still does, but I haven't seen recent articles on this. Vice President Cheney gave away 78% of his income in 2005. That's not a typo. He gave $8.8 million. That's pretty impressive, isn't it? What about the current vice president and president, the Obama Biden team? Well, first of all, remember these statements during their first campaign, which I read to you several classes ago? We want to take money and put it back in the pocket of middle-class people. Anyone making over $250,000 a year is going to pay more. You got it. It's time to be patriotic. See, that's the classic mindset of redistributing the wealth, of viewing the general welfare clause as saying we're going to take from the rich. They wouldn't say steal from the rich. Take from the rich and give to the poor. Obama, same thing. I think when you spread the wealth around, it's good for everybody. Notice, and I made this point before, this is classic Marxist thinking. Now, they may not want to call it Marxist, but it's Marxist thinking. I mean, Marx said from each according to his ability to each according to his need. In other words, if you make more as you are able, you are then to give to those who are in need. And they are to, now, of course, since people aren't going to do that to the degree that Karl Marx wanted voluntarily, that's when you need a government to forcibly do this, right? But here's the hypocrisy. The people who advocate doing this, and they try to sound like they're being generous, they're not generous with their own money. You know, look at Joe Biden. He gave less than $4,000 to charity over a 10-year period. You know, if your parents were to make $40,000 in just 1 year, and I'm sure every single one of your parents like makes way more than this, but just for the sake of example, if they only made $40,000 in 1 year and they tithed on that, they would pay more to charity in 1 year than Biden did in 10 years. And same thing with Barack Obama. He was giving less than 2% until he actually started looking to a presidential run in 2005. And even then, his giving was less than 10%. But see, both Obama and Biden, while they personally give very little, they want to take your money and give it away. You know, today our government gives to all kinds of things. You know, government charity had become so ridiculous that the government had started even paying farmers not to grow corn and not to raise hogs. Remember that story in the book? I mean, how ridiculous was that? I mean, you know, the letter was kind of a spoof, but it was based on real live events. That's what our government gets involved in, you know. And government welfare gets ridiculous because they're not spending their own money. You know, you would never spend your own money for that kind of charity, but if it's not your money, then what do you care? This is a copy of World Magazine from 2007, which dealt with this issue. Again, I've mentioned this before. World Magazine's a great magazine. You know, I hope you guys get it in the home. If not, ask your parents. Doesn't affect me. I mean, I'm not like on the board or anything like that. I'm just saying it's a good magazine from a biblical perspective. But anyway, this particular issue showed how politicians in Washington vote for all kinds of spending. And of course, in Washington, they call this pork, and hence the piggy there on the front. Maybe you've heard that phrase, but they call it pork. Politicians try to get all kinds of taxpayer money sent back to their districts. And why do you think they do that? Why would a politician try to get all kinds of money sent back to their own district? What do you think's the reason for that? Raise their approval rating. Yes, get more votes. Well, here's just some examples, just some from that one particular year that were in the government spending bill that was highlighted by this article. $100,000 of taxpayer money for a hunting and fishing museum in Pennsylvania, $250,000 for a wine and culinary center in Washington, $628,000 for grape genetics research at Cornell University. And here's one, $1 million for a museum dedicated to Woodstock. By the way, Woodstock, that's not Snoopy's friend, okay? Was a rock concert in the 60s. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe not. But anyway, thankfully, that spending earmark was defeated. But about 8,000 of these spending earmarks survived, totaling billions of taxpayer dollars that year for just a lot of the things that I mentioned. In fact, in 2008, then Representative Jeff Flake of Arizona, he's now a senator, highlighted the top 10 most horrendous spending earmarks of 2008. And Flake is pretty funny. I mean, he has a good time with this. And so he goes through the bill, he shows you like ridiculous spending, and then he makes a comment on it. So in a spending bill, Flake found, for example, $282,000 for blackbird management in the Dakotas. And so Flake's comment about this was, this Congress has nothing to crow about when it comes to earmark spending reform. I mean, this is my kind of guy. I mean, he's got the puns flying right by you. You know, you got to pay attention or they will fly right by you. Sorry about that. Here's another one. $372,000 for a swine and other animal waste management in North Carolina. To this, Flake says, this earmark spending doesn't pass the smell test. You might say Flake has a real nose for detecting wasteful spending. Yeah, talk about real pork spending, right? Here's another one, $351,000 for the Asian longhorn beetle in Illinois. I mean, I didn't even know there were longhorn beetles in Illinois. Regarding this, Flake says, this earmark really bugs me. Yeah, Flake has his antennas up in search of wasteful spending, you might say. And then this last one. I mean, you got to pay close attention to this one. I love this one, though. $394,000 for the Iron Workers Training Program. Okay, tell me how many puns you can find in this one. Regarding this, he says, ironically, this earmark spending is anything but a steal. Fiscal responsibility can rust in peace. How many puns did you hear in that one? It was more than one. Very good. 3. Ironically, anything but a steal. Fiscal responsibility can rust in peace. Pretty funny stuff. Anyway, so these are the types of spending that, you know, we frequently see in bills, but these are the easy ones to hate. I mean, what about the hard ones, the more difficult ones? Like anytime there's been a tragedy, you know, something like Hurricane Katrina back in 2005, the costliest natural disaster that hit the United States at that time, billions of dollars in damage. And the government gave out billions of dollars to those who were, you know, who had lost their homes and things like that. And after all, who can say no to that? You know, I mean, who can say no to helping people in need? Well, we'll talk about that next week, how that actually makes the problem worse. So we'll talk about that. But today, politicians want to promise help for everybody. Free welfare, free health care. You know, what a change from the past. Like when the Pilgrims came here, there was no government health care, no welfare, no food stamps, no public housing. You know, William Bradford in his history of Plymouth Plantation talks about that. There were no inns that they could stay in. You know, there was nothing like that. But today, politicians want to stick their hands into your pockets to pay for any and every need that somebody might have. So what's the problem with that? I mean, let's say I favored that. What would you say to me as an answer as to here's the problem with that kind of thing? And let's say I said, you know, but it's important to be generous and, you know, you need to pay your fair share. I mean, come on, folks. You know, anybody who makes over a certain amount, you know, we're just asking you to contribute just a little bit. Of course, you say, oh, what if I don't want to contribute? Oh, well, you'll go to jail for not paying your taxes. Well, that doesn't sound like a contribution then. No, but politicians love to call it contributions. So, yeah, what would you say to me if I took the view, you know, this is okay and this is government's responsibility? How would you answer me? And by the way, Ella, yes, now Senator Flake does use those kind of puns. Christina says, if the government can put bread on your table, he can take it away. Boy, that's not a bad answer. Not a bad answer. Yeah, you give government that power to spend money to help people, then that means they're going to have the power to take money from you. By the way, what happens when you make something free? You know, when you have, you know, free giveaways, you know, that type of free health care, free welfare. What happens when you make something free? Do people want more or less of it? Ellis says it loses its value. Yeah, because it can result in inflation, um, especially if it involves printing money or expanding credit. Gray says people take advantage. Yes, people can take advantage of it because they demand more of it, don't they? Let me give you a classic example of what Gray said, taking advantage of it. I live in Fairfax County, Virginia. And it used to be that, if you called 911 and they sent an ambulance to get you in your moment of need, that you would have a free ride to the hospital. Now, as of 2008, they charge. It started with $250 at first. Now it's $500. What? Isn't that harsh? I mean, what if a person can't afford the ride? Why do you think Fairfax County changed their policy and started charging people? Well, it's what Grace said. People started taking uh, taking advantage. As Ella says, they were misusing it. People would use it as a taxi service. No lie. Now, not like to go to a restaurant or something, but let's say people had minor things like a bad cold, or they'd been to the hospital and so they needed to go back for like a follow up or something. I mean, people do that all the time, and they just get in the cars, have somebody drive them. It's not an emergency, but people would use 911 that way, and so it became so abused. They started charging to cut down on the abuse. See, when you give something away for free, people will demand more than they really need. Let me give you another example of how this gets abused. I mentioned Hurricane Katrina. Well, the federal government gave out debit cards so that homeless people could buy food. And I mean, that certainly sounds compassionate, right? I mean, they've lost their homes. I mean, you want to take care of people. So this sounds, very reasonable, very compassionate. Well, guess what? They studied this later and found out that these debit cards, while on the one hand, people were using them for legitimate things, they were also grossly abused. And in some of the worst cases, they found that the debit cards were being used to buy things like expensive purses and suits, like Gucci and Prada. They were used to buy diamonds. I mean, can you imagine that? Like girls getting proposed to, and the guy who's proposing basically wasn't any skin off his back because he was using a taxpayer-funded debit card. And get ready for this. In some cases, they even found that they were used to pay for, I hope you're sitting down, for breast implants. I mean, talk about talk about taking advantage and scamming the system. You see, when government gives out free money, people do take advantage of that and they game the system. You actually have better accountability with private groups like Red Cross and things like that. But speaking of gaming the system, did you hear about the Solyndra scandal? I mean, this was a few years back, and you may not have heard of this. But the Obama administration gave $535 million to a solar power company, which eventually ended up going bankrupt. Now, this became a scandal because it turned out the Obama administration knew the company was hurting badly when they gave our taxpayer dollars to the country. So why would the Obama administration give them the money? Well, number one, they wanted to appear like they were supporting green energy, and that's important for Democrats, that's important for liberals. But also, the executives of the company were huge Democrat donors. So it was payback for them in a good way, like it was thanking them. I mean, this became such a bad scandal that the comedian in the upper left-hand corner, Jon Stewart, he's a hardcore Democrat. He actually was making fun of the Obama administration because of this scandal. I mean, that tells you things are not going well for you. But this is one of the problems with letting government officials redistribute our money. They often do it in a way that makes them look bad and helps them get more votes. If there's a silver lining, I suppose that polls show that the American people, 59% of Americans agree with Ronald Reagan. Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. I mean, that is good news. But unfortunately, there's really too many people that think that things like Solyndra, giving money to green energy, Now these two other examples I'm going to hold just for a second. It's actually, you'll hear the Obama money example in Detroit and the Peggy Joseph example in the URL that I gave you earlier, and I'll put it right there again. But let me, just since we're getting near the end of time, let me go to this slide and talk about how Obama answered his critics. Because during his first election, Obama took a lot of heat for his views on redistributing the wealth. And here's how he defended himself. And I want to, as I'm reading this, think how you would answer this. So remember, he was running against John McCain. John McCain and Sarah Palin, they call this socialistic, this whole idea of redistributing the wealth. I don't know when they decided they wanted to make a virtue out of selfishness. The next thing I know, they're going to find evidence of my communistic tendencies because I shared my toys in kindergarten, because I split my peanut butter and jelly sandwich with my friend in 6th grade. What's wrong with that statement? He's mocking them, okay, for their criticism of him for redistributing the wealth. Ella, you nailed it. All the examples he gave were of his own things, right? He is perfectly free to share his toys or split his peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Although, looking at his giving, his private giving, I would be willing to bet he probably wasn't sharing his toys or splitting his peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But putting that aside, yeah, he's free to do that. He can voluntarily give anything of his that he wants. But what he was being criticized for was the forcible redistribution of wealth. See, that's the hypocrisy of this whole thing. He tries to sound like he's being generous, but he's not being generous with his own money. He's being generous with your money. So, today we looked at, in looking at this principle, we saw that actually God is interested in caring for the poor, and churches and individuals and families, private groups, all have a responsibility to help care for the poor. But civil government is not supposed to, and quite frankly, they're not supposed to, because the only way they can do it is stealing money from you. They're not giving their own money, so it's not really charity. Okay, we have bumped up to the end of the hour and a half marker. So what I'll do is, just as we're going into, and I'm going to have to run to a doctor's appointment. Otherwise, I'd kind of watch it with you in these last 5 minutes, because it's only two minutes long, and get brief comments. But I'll just put you on your own honor to watch it. It's very brief, and you'll see some, I would say, entertaining examples of people's mindset of how the government is just there to provide for me. And so I wanted you to hear that. But I do have with my back issue, I've got to go run to the chiropractor. So let me wrap it up here. Are there any questions before we depart? Obviously, this is the last class of the year, so I won't see you till next year. Love saying that. Won't see you till next year, guys. Anyway, Merry Christmas to all. And to all a good night. Well, only for some of you who are in Europe, right? Anyway, you guys have a great Christmas break. Have enjoyed the year so far. We're off for 2 weeks. Woohoo! Boy, it's a much needed break, isn't it? Anyway, remember the reason for the season. Enjoy our Savior and be grateful to Him. And again, there's your homework for, again, not for Christmas Eve. It's not due Christmas Eve, January 7th. God bless everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.